experts of Ukrainian reality to do such a study, because for years we are accompanying very intensively the transformation of Ukrainian society. We are looking into the development of the modern Ukraine over the last 20-25 years. And during some visits I personally had made to the country, I found out that there is a lot of disappointment among citizens in the country who hoped through more cooperation with the European Union there would be direct benefits for the daily life, socially, in the relationship of employment policies, etc. And of course, the complicated situation after the takeover of the Crimea Peninsula by the conflict in the eastern Ukrainian part, it is always excused that the difficult economic and social situation in Ukraine is linked to just these facts. And I personally think that is only half of the truth, or even less than half of the truth. It's much more linked to the unfinished transformation process started immediately after the constitutionalization of Ukraine in 1992. And with the redistribution of commonwealth produced by the workers, by those who are working in the services industries, into private pocket by the oligarchy structures. And that is not so different to that what is going on in the Russian Federation. I mean, we have a similar picture, and therefore we found it very interesting coming into closer contact with the authors of the study to find out what is the concrete situation and who is doing what. And so we asked three more even specialists to deal with our undertaking to look into the details. What does it mean? And today with us is Alexander Antoniuk. He's a member of the Ukrainian non-governmental organizations Social Movement and holds Dr. Philosophy degree in statistics from the University of Oxford. Welcome, Alexander. We have with us Tommaso Faccio. He's the head of the Secretariat of the Independent Commission for the Reform on International Corporate Taxation and the lecturer for accounting at Nottingham University Business School. He's also a chartered accountant and a member of the BFGS monitoring group. And we have Zahar Popovich. He's the deputy director of the Center for Social and Labor Research in Kiev, Ukraine, so he's coming directly from Kiev. And he's also co-founder of the NGO Social Movement. His recent publications focused on the effects of the Ukraine-EU Association Agreement and the economic development linked to that and social conditions in Ukraine, including consequences for sovereign debt. And we had Graham Stuck, who is an experienced researcher of offshores, tax schemes. He is fluent in Russian and Ukrainian. He provided a lot of research trips, I would say, to Ukraine, finding out what is going on in the field. So, and that means that he is unfortunately today not with us, but is one of the collaborators of this study. Veronica, maybe you can introduce yourself, because you are the only female face here in the round, so which is not really gender balanced, but sometimes it is the case, and we can't solve it in a different way. So I want to give you the floor, and afterwards I would ask our authors to introduce the study itself, what you have found out, so afterwards we have the chance to discuss certain fact findings we have presented today. So Veronica, first you.
Thank you, Carlos. Well, my name is Veronica Grondona, and I'm an advisor for GUE-NGL in relation to the Tax 3 committee now, and previously to the PANA committee. So I'm just going to make a brief introduction of how to put this study in context. As you all know, the European Parliament has been discussing many changes in EU legislation lately that have as an objective tackling tax evasion, tax avoidance, and money laundering. Some of them are the 5th Anti-Money Laundering Direction, the amendments to the Directive on Administrative Cooperation in the field of taxation that was extended to include the mandatory automatic exchange of financial account information, the exchange of cross-border tax rulings and advanced pricing agreements, public country-by-country reporting, the access to anti-money laundering information, reportable cross-border arrangements also, or the regulation of enablers and promoters of tax evasion, tax avoidance, and money laundering. And there's also, there has also been a discussion on the common corporate tax base and common consolidated corporate tax base known as the CCTB and CCCTB, and the anti-tax avoidance directly. And more recently, there's the Parliament is discussing the proposals on digital taxation, and even a report on taxation and gender inequality. So the gender balance is going to be addressed at some point in taxation matters, among other things. So the European Commission itself and the Council have also been working on other issues, such as the identification of high-risk third countries and the list of non-cooperative jurisdictions for tax purposes. And well, I'm not going to go into the details of the pros and cons of all this, but some of these issues have also been addressed by the European Parliament in 4 inquiry committees or special committees, starting from tax and afterwards tax 2. And the PANA Inquiry Committee, and currently the ongoing Tax 3 Special Committee on Financial Crimes, Tax evasion and tax avoidance. And there's also a discussion on the creation of a permanent subcommittee that will continue to address these issues. So the Parliament is currently discussing all these topics. However, one discussion that has not entered any of these legislative proposals or these inquiry committees is that of the is a discussion which is very relevant to developing countries, for instance, which has to do with one of the most relevant sources of illicit financial flows for such countries, which is that arising from the mispricing of the export of primary goods. Yes. So this is actually this is the topic of this study, and for that reason it is a very relevant study for the European Parliament and all inquiry committees, so on. So I'm now giving the word here to Alexander.
Thank you, Veronica. Let me first agree with Helmut that indeed transformation of Ukraine since 1991 is far from being finished, and you'll particularly see it from our study. And then how do you switch sides?
I just do it here.
Yeah, okay.
Just give me a sign.
Yeah, okay. So let's pose a question for today's presentation. Are EU taxpayers financing Ukrainian oligarchs' windfall profits? So windfall profits are super profits far above the cost of production. So let's step back to Panama Papers. which revealed that some of the most expensive London properties you can see on the picture was hundreds of millions of UK pounds were used as payments to settle dispute of over one of the iron ore mines in Ukraine. So the investigators revealed that the previous owner estimated the loss from this mine, from the loss of control of one of the mines, to be $2 billion. So remember this figure. Then the paper quoted that annual profit of the mine was only 40 million US dollars, which means that the owner was claiming about 50 years worth of mine's profit in the settlement over this. So then the investigators also claimed that the export price from this mine was about half of the world prices. So this facts indicated that these findings, that there is much more profit generated in that particular iron ore mine than you can see in Ukrainian financial statements, in financial statements of the Ukrainian branch of the company. Then, to add to the story that Helmut started on how this study originated, on the 4th of May 2017, 440 iron ore miners of the same mine that was under dispute between oligarchs in London court didn't come out from underground, stayed underneath, and wanted to start a strike over wage dispute. They wanted increase of their very small wages. So it's easy to understand why the miners had to resort to such drastic measures. So they knew that the owners are billionaires, and they were aware of Panama Papers, revelations like that, that the owners shifting around hundreds of millions. The miners also got the lowest salaries in the world among all iron ore producers, around $300 per month. And if you think life is cheaper in Ukraine, it's not really. The bills for heating bills are now the same as in Europe. So imagine living for the miners on this such salary and paying $100 a month heating bills. So following these events in the iron ore mine, the miners started also official legal procedure in Ukraine, which leads to a strike. So after negotiations from last year, they started the procedure in March this year. So now it's September, and they're still not allowed to start a strike. So it's been 6 months since bureaucratic procedures in Ukraine to start a strike. So Zahar can add later maybe details to this. Now, in that particular mine, which sells about 5 million tons of iron ore per year, only $6 per ton covers all of the wages of the miners. So the owners could pay the wages, say at the low point of the market, when the price was $37 in 2016. But then when the prices went up, as you see, or were much higher before, it would only take them $6 increase in price to double the wages. And you see the prices have risen a lot more than $6. But the response to the miners was there is no money to raise salaries. So the same arguments as in this graph apply to taxes. So if profits can increase so much when the price goes up, so why don't the Ukrainian branches of these companies pay more taxes? Also, intriguingly, Ukrainian authorities themselves actually publicly stated that there is a lot of profit shifting through transfer pricing in Ukrainian exports. This slide is from presentation by the head of the National Bank of Ukraine, who showed, I'm sorry, it's in Ukrainian, who shows the main commodity exports items out of Ukraine. The numbers indicate billions of dollars of annual exports, and the iron ore is 2.6 billions. And in this slide, she claims, she publicly stated that the absolute majority of the exports are done via low taxation jurisdictions. And then went on in the presentation saying that the budget is losing a lot of tax from transfer pricing. So all these facts that I just presented back last year when we started this project indicated that there is significant profit shifting occurring, at least in the iron ore sector. So there was the trade unions, the independent trade unions in the iron ore mines approached us, activists from NGOs, for help, analytical help, because they were facing this blank statement from the owners, there is no money. But they knew that there is money. They asked us to provide analytical support to their suspicions. So we gathered international team to do this study, and this is how this study originated. Now I'd like to hand over to Tommaso to talk about the more academic and analytical side of the study.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. On top of what Alexander said, also tax authorities Ukraine came out publicly to say that profit shifting in the iron ore industry is around 3 billion per year. You're probably all familiar with some of the tax avoidance techniques that multinational can avoid taxation, often through transfer pricing and to shift profits from high tax countries into low tax countries. Transfer pricing is the price that the affiliates transact with each other. That can be for sale of goods, so in this case export of iron ore, or could be for royalties, funding, or provisional services. So for multinational operating in the commodity industry, the process is quite simple. You can see that if you want to avoid taxation, you sell your product at a lower price to a affiliate resident in a low tax jurisdiction. Then the ultimate customer would be resident anywhere across the world, but by playing on the tax arbitrage between the different countries, in this case between Switzerland and Ukraine, that allows shifting of profits into Switzerland, which are subject to zero or low taxation, and lower profits in Ukraine. That of course depletes the government revenues in Ukraine and is good for multinational, but not so good for the Ukrainian government. You're all also familiar with those the tax avoidance scandals that Google, Facebook, Apple, Starbucks were the focus on around 2012, and as a result of political pressure, Ukraine introduced avoidance legislation through transfer pricing legislation to try to stop to regulate the pricing of export between related parties. That happened in 2013. So from 2013, and there were a number of subsequent revisions to the legislation. Ukraine has in place a legislation that requires export companies to price the transaction between each other. So when the Ukrainian affiliate sells to the Swiss affiliate of the same group, that price should be by reference to a market price. And so we decided that to test whether this was the case, we obtain information, market data information for the price of goods, and similarly export data, custom data, or individual transaction of these multinationals for the export of iron ore over a number of years, and compare the price to say whether actually that market price was being used. And what we identified with some variation is that there is a significant difference, around 20%, and therefore this poses a number of questions. So the difference, the maximum difference that is allowed by Ukrainian tax authorities is 5%. So we outlined that there is a significant higher difference, and so this points to a high risk of profit shifting, tax avoidance activities by Ukrainian multinationals. In order to corroborate our research, we also look at identifying the difference in the profitability of the local entities in Ukraine and the overall group. profitability of the multinational, to identify whether there is a high risk of tax avoidance, and when this was possible, we identified that there is a big difference between the overall profitability of this multinational and some of the affiliates in Ukraine. So this analysis points to a potential big issue for Ukraine in terms of revenue losses, but a number of questions that needs to be addressed, because if there is legislation in place, we don't know whether this legislation is being implemented. It is complex legislation, and some countries even developed countries find it hard to implement this type of legislation. And so it'd be interesting, I think, to develop this further to understand how this issue can be addressed. And I'd like to ask Zakhar to actually talk you through the methodology and the overall results of our analysis.
Yes, I hope. Yes. My name is Zakhar Popovich. I hold a PhD from National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine in economics, and I'm affiliated with the Center of Social Labor Research in Kyiv. It's independent NGO. And my job as a data scientist in this research team was mainly to get, clean, and process the export data records. And now my responsibility is to present the methodology of calculations we actually did. So of course it's nothing new in the fact that there are huge volumes of profit shifting from Ukraine. So the novelty of our study is that we think that it's more reliable and precise because we use per transaction export data, and we use daily records for all corresponding indices of prices, prices for goods, transportation tariffs, and exchange rates, and so on. No, it's not usual to most of such studies to use such a detailed data. We obtained a database with more than 50,000 transaction records. Actually, it's the same for the period we had data of 2011, 2017. This is actually the same database that is maintained by Ukrainian customs authorities and are available for Fiscal Service of Ukraine, and available in Ukraine in different versions, some of them legally, some unofficially, but we used the version of this database that is distributed by Import Genius. It's a kind of independent commercial institution for distribution such data. So we believe that we have records virtually for every batch of iron ore across the Ukrainian border in the period under analysis. And the prices recorded in this database are actually the prices that are used for taxation calculations. And we find it that these prices are significantly lower than the corresponding world prices. We used the very authoritative source of data, the Platts data, with separately for different, for all major types of iron ore, particularly for fines, pellets, we considering the different levels of content of pure iron for 72, 74, and etc. And also we used the also from Platts the indices for transportation to China. For example, we use index of shipment for price from Yuzhny to China, distributed from Platts. So it is very detailed and reliable data used on the market, but it is expensive. The Platts data is very expensive. So unfortunately, these studies are not so easy to conduct for independent researchers. We thank you very much for support. And so everywhere where possible, we used the daily data. And of course, there could be some points where where we could not be sure for some transactions how to compare the corresponding price, but generally we believe that our approach based on the full data set that I believe will someday will be available for public, and so it could be used on the principles of reproductive research by every researcher, and I think that such approach will help to make these calculations as reliable as possible. I also mentioned that it is not the first study. In this study, only the iron ore export covered but 2 years ago, the Center for Social and Labor Research, under the leadership of our researcher Vakulchyk, made a study for agriculture export, and we find out also it was not that detailed. We have no, for example, daily data for goods. We have no access to Platts data, but we had some customs data, and it was a study only of 4 major intermediary countries and 15 major export categories, and we found out that for a period of 2012-2015, it was around 18 billion of US dollars of profit shifting from Ukraine, and corresponding to that, for agriculture export, it was around 9 billion of profits escaped the profit tax from Ukraine. I will finish probably, yes, but so I will finish with the point that it is absolutely clear that losses from profit shifting are in Ukraine are probably much higher than some losses from corruption, and even more precisely, it's actually the one system of legalized corruption that is used by Ukrainian oligarchs and governmental structures, which are all connected in some schemes. And all these losses actually could be easily calculated and stopped if it would be a political will to enforce such regulations and really collect taxes.
Well, there'll be, yeah, thanks, Zahar, a bit more on this in our final slides. So now let's move on to conclusions. So we identify a big issue for Ukraine and for Europeans, as you saw in our study, because the EU taxpayers have to fill in these gaps in the budget. So now, how can this be stopped? So Tommaso pointed to 2 possibilities. One is that the change in legislation is required, and the other is if legislation is actually already tight, that maybe tight implementation is required. So let's consider 2 options. So one is if change in legislation is required. So I just illustrate, I'm sorry to this very wealthy man on the picture on the left to can pick him, but he's been in the Ukrainian parliament for a long time. He's one of the owners of the iron ore mines, so we're not legally claiming that he's a particular culprit, but to illustrate the point, if change in legislation is required, and in the parliament we have people like Konstantin Zhivago, who's been in the parliament since 1998, who is the youngest billionaire in Europe. He's in top 7 billionaires in Ukraine, and allegedly has financed Yulia Tymoshenko's party until recently. So can we expect realistically that legislation against the interest of such people and in favor of the interest of the majority of Ukrainians can be put through the parliament? It's a question for discussion. If the second option is required, tighter implementation through it's the control of the export transaction is done by the State Fiscal Service of Ukraine. So in the picture on the right, you can see the just dismissed head of the Fiscal Service. So what's going on there? 3 years ago, previous head of Fiscal Service was dismissed on allegations of corruption. There is an ongoing investigation. Since then, for the last 3 years, Prodan was only acting head of the State Fiscal Service. They couldn't nominate proper one for 3 years. Now he's dismissed on allegations of corruption. So can we expect realistically from Ukrainian government that Fiscal Service can do this rigorous analysis that took us almost a year to conduct in the interest of the majority of Ukrainians? Also, question to Ukrainian authorities: what are the results of the investigations against the previous head of the Fiscal Service and the current head of Fiscal Service? Do the allegations include export transfer pricing, a lack of control of transfer pricing? So all these questions we're posing to the government. Also, another small piece of information, there have been court cases. We have to say that the Fiscal Service has started some court cases against exporters regarding transfer pricing, but as far as we know, that they usually result in the court decision in favor of the exporters. So there's no ruling against them to pay penalties for reduced prices. So our conclusion from this is that without big political change inside Ukraine, it's impossible to stop profit shifting. So there should be rebalancing of internal political scene where in legislation, in the government, it's interest of the majority represented, not only the interest of the small group of very wealthy people. And now, Zahar, maybe to conclude what he started on political.
I would also add a couple of points. So, of course, Ukraine is probably some kind of the worst example, of this absolutely huge and profit shifting and absolutely oligarchic government and so on. But you know, this is a kind of international system because Ukrainian exporters are exporting to EU countries or to countries which are like Switzerland, which are connected with EU, or to Luxembourg. Luxembourg and Switzerland are two major destinations for Ukrainian iron ore products, and there are some intermediaries in this and other countries, in Slovakia, for example, and somehow we can find this information about the customs price, registered price for Ukrainian iron ore export from Ukraine, but we can hardly find the price. It is not public, the price on which the ArcelorMittal plants are buying this iron ore in EU. It's not public what is the price of import and export of this iron ore from Luxembourg when it is or from Switzerland or Slovakia when it is goes with intermediaries. So yes, it probably European Union is not that corrupt as Ukraine, but European oligarchs. There are also some oligarchs inside EU and probably some international class of such oligarchs who are backing and who are connected in these schemas. And probably we need not only push Ukraine, which is absolutely clearly the first point what we should, but we should unite to change some international system which allows the transfer pricing and profit shifting from Ukraine and from other countries. Ukraine, unfortunately, is not unique.
Okay. Thanks, Zahar. Then the final slide. Let's conclude. So we're in Brussels, and the project was joined with our European partners. So maybe let's try to make some political conclusions related to the EU. So as we demonstrated, this issue is not particularly Ukrainian, because it inevitably affects Europeans and especially taxpayers. So in our view, European politicians are fully entitled to demand to retain profits in Ukraine. And they should demand the government of Ukraine to take measures to stop this profit shifting, be it legal or administrative measures required. But we know that social groups like oligarchs, they will not give up their interest without a fight. So there should be political pressure on them. So political pressure could come. Excuse me, one more point I'd like to make. So we're not arguing to stop financial support totally from the EU to Ukraine. We just think it should be put to better use. So right now it's used to fill in the gaps essentially created by oligarchs and shifting profits to them. So this could be instead used, for example, for joint research and development projects, for infrastructure investments in Ukraine. So there would be welcome and better use of the EU money. Now, we can probably start brainstorming together with the EU partners what can be done about this profit shifting. And as we see, it touches on politics, and it touches on the dissolving political power. You see in the picture, this is the head of the EU delegation to Ukraine, Mingarelli. And in the interview to BBC, he said that the main obstacle is the private interest, which formed the social, economic and political life in Ukraine for 22 years. So this is the big issue that needs to be tackled together by Ukrainian opposition and the EU partners. How can oligarchic power be dissolved? So let's brainstorm. So this system in Ukraine results in a huge economic inequality. But many of you probably don't know that what's it called, individual income tax. Individual income tax in Ukraine is flat, unlike in the majority of EU countries. It's something like 17 or 18%. There's no progressive taxation. So this is also used to preserve this huge inequality. And for the Europeans, social justice is one of the fundamental values. So if Ukraine is moving towards the EU, why don't European politicians put pressure on Ukraine to make it a more equal society, for example, by introducing progressive taxation? Other measures of dissolving political power could be demanding mechanisms for creating more democratic representation in power, in the parliament and in the government. For example, the new law in Ukraine on the financing of political parties allows only the parties who pass quite high hurdle, about 5% in the parliamentary elections, to get state financing. So this should be changed to widen the financial support to opposition, because now it's dominated by big parties financed by very rich people. Also, there should be, for example, tighter control on election budgets. To give you an example, right now, if you go to Kiev, travel to Kiev, and drive around the streets, you'll see already presidential campaign, although it officially has not started, with a lot of very expensive political advertisements. So all this money for the advertisement comes from private sources. So maybe there should be tighter control on election budgets, so that smaller groups representing interests of wider population can participate in these elections. Another issue is media control. So in Ukrainian elections, controlling the media is very important. And there's research analysis showing that the main media channels are controlled by oligarchic groups. So again, why don't the EU put some pressure in Ukraine to make this more democratic? Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I mean, a lot of facts you have put on the table. You have also put on the table some thoughts and proposals, and I want first of welcome also colleagues from two groups. Mr. Gala, who is a rapporteur in the Foreign Affairs Committee for the Association Agreement EU-Ukraine. Mr. Stofanov, who is a Green EPA group. So, I mean, we have also here different political groups sitting, and we can discuss the conclusion you presented and what does it mean for our policy adjustments in the European Union's and Parliament's approach to the further relationship with Ukraine. Let me put only two more problems, or adding two more problems to the whole discussion. Is that we have the experience that we have always the payments as a separate financial and political instrument in the bilateral relationship in Ukraine, that the so-called microfinancial assistance. And that is a grant, and that means that we are giving into the Ukrainian budget for solving certain economic problems a lot of money, which is taxpayers' money from the citizens of the 28 EU member states. So the question is what we reached in the last 2, 3, 4 years, a much more stronger conditionalization of the granting of this MFA, but nevertheless we are granting the money. And Commissioner Dombrovskis came just last year to us and said we need an urgent application for the next tranche of the next MFA for this year and next year. What means that from the democratic point of view, the Parliament has not enough time to discuss what are the conditions, what are the concrete criteria and situation on the ground for checking if it is really needed in that amount of money or less amount of money. I mean, and therefore I think it's very interesting to compare what is under the line. So at least if I understood it well, your study, that means almost the same sum which is crossed aboard the taxation, is that money what the European Union is giving to the Ukraine from the EU budget. So I mean, here we have to, of course, to go in much more detail and discuss it in the Parliament. What are the conditions, how we are checking the access situation for granting MFA for the Ukraine to restructure the economy or to give this money into the social budget, etc., etc. So I mean, in this way, I want also say the study is very important for the further discussions we have here in the Parliament. And the second remark I want to make, this week is also another study coming to the introduction to the European Parliament from an international NGO, Earthside, which is dealing with the international and Ukrainian undertaking in the forest industry in Ukraine, complicit in corruption, how billion-dollar firms and new governments are failing Ukraine's forests. So I mean, that is another aspect dealing with similar or analog developments in the Ukrainian state. So that would be my presentation to you, and I would ask you to give your impressions, questions, etc. I know that Mr. Gala was just recently in Ukraine, so you can deal maybe with the latest impressions on that.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm grateful for this study. It sheds a light on these issues with regard to iron ore exports. You mentioned just another one on the forests, on this illegal wood cutting that takes place. One could add many things where things are ongoing without a legal base and where people are enriching themselves. Now, I would say it's probably all true and it happens as it is described. I think, contrary to perhaps some other countries, in Ukraine, these guys who are acting in this way are fortunately under a different pressure than in other countries, because they cannot assume that those who are politically cooperating with them, be it us or be it the International Monetary Fund, that we simply accept the practices that they have done for so many years, 22 years here it says in Riabych. and rightly so. And so there is conditionality, which is clear. There is pressure, and I would say within all the political parties of relevance, you have both reformers and those who are the old guys, who want to continue in the old way. So we have seen people who came from the Maidan, the second Maidan, and said, okay, we will go into the different parties, stand for the election, and thereby try and change them. And we are going and are putting pressure, and I would say, as soon as some reforms are ongoing, there is then the resistance coming up, but at the end we are getting along. Like this high anti-corruption court, it took long, but it is, for instance, also such details like where will the next instance take place. It's now clear after pressure from the IMF over the summer, if the next instance comes, it will be the new anti-corruption court. That is only one example. And I'm very much in favor that we keep this multifaceted pressure and plus transparency plus support for all the reforms that are ongoing. And such issues here, when it becomes open, and I think that is a good contribution, like this one and others, they enter the public, they are being discussed, and those old structures are increasingly under pressure. What I'm trying to engage with is, I'm telling those, and I'm not saying it to an individual person, but when I'm there in speeches, I'm saying, I have good news for all those who are rich in this country. In a functioning democracy, you can be rich and law-abiding. It goes together. And we have rich people in law-abiding countries. But I'm telling them, have a good product or deliver good service and don't fix it on your good connections that you've got. And I think this behavior, this instrumentalization of state institutions for private purposes, there's private interests from, that is the evil, the big evil. But I think the citizens do not accept it there, and we should form this coalition of those who want to get this country democratic, those who want to do it within the parties, those who want to do it within civil society, and those who want to do it in the reformed institutions. I think Nabu, Mr. Sitnik, Artem Sitnik is a very valuable person that needs to be supported. And those who are hopefully incoming into this new court need to be supported. And the agenda needs to address all these issues like this one. I think the customs service is one of the major, and it goes together, customs service and such exports, all these shipping, that is more or less the same structure where it all goes through. I think we should concentrate thereon. What I would a bit, so to say, object or caution is that we would demand from the Ukrainians to do more than we do. I mean, I'm also in favor personally on a customs on a tax system that has increasing progressive tax and not the flat rate. But we have EU member countries who have these flat rates. So how can we arguably tell the Ukrainians not to have a flat tax? Although on the substance I would agree, it's better to have a progressive tax rate. Or who gets party financing? I think what comes from the state sources is a minimum thing in comparison to what they actually spend. We should focus on transparency in this regard, that people know, and that is what I'm telling as an election observer. Wherever you try in a given country to have control of election or to have ceilings, how much could be spent, any artificial ceiling automatically provokes a bypass strategy. So focus on transparency. If you know who finances a party, then you can decide, am I in favor of that or not? So let's try to get that also done, but in a way where at the end it arrives so the people can understand why we have this agenda and not another one. At the end, I'm confident that the public and also the real reformers, not those who pretend, the public and the real reformers will prevail because that is the only perspective for the society as a whole. Otherwise, if it goes back in the old habits that we have seen in the 20 years before, that will lead to desperation and a pushback. So thanks for this study. It needs more, like those that you mentioned and others, to put up and increase the pressure for getting the country where it should orient itself.
Thank you, the authors, for very interesting and study which can show us what are the real situation with taxes and political processes in Ukraine. But I have several maybe objections or thoughts about if this approach is fair. The main third of this investigation is expressed in the introduction, the second abstract, where is told that the budgetary loss is equivalent or is compatible to the scale of the annual macroeconomical assistance received by Ukraine from the European Union in the last several years to fill the budgetary gap. And of course, it will be good if such information will be reflected also as a picture on, as a slide on your presentation. But I'm convinced that European Union is not helping Ukraine only because it is a good country or it is a poor country. The help, the assistance of European Union is aimed to support pro-European, pro-West development of the Ukraine. So it is investing in geopolitical choice of this country, and it is more profitable than loss of billions of European euros. When we are looking what European Union has received from Ukrainian in the last years after the revolution, we can see that first of all it's a cheap labor force. Ukrainians now feel the gap of deficit of labor force in Poland, and even in the Baltic states we see more and more labor migrants from Ukraine. So is the first one, and the second is the big market. It's approximately 30 million of residents who can buy European goods now, according to the treaties of free trade between the European Union and Ukraine. So this assistance is not of European Union only as such idealistic help for poor Ukrainian people. Well, but about the investments and the taxes. I think that it will be very important to track what is the fate of the money which is profit shifting from Ukraine, from this profit which is paid in, for example, in Switzerland or Luxembourg or in other countries. How do these oligarchs, the owners of companies, how do they use this money? Either they are buying real estate in some stable countries, or they are investing in some financial instruments, wild board, or they are reinvesting this money in Ukraine. So they are not paying taxes. I may think that it may happen also, and investing in some spheres of economy in their native country. Because sometimes when we are looking at Russia, for example, and the owners of the big companies, they prefer to register their enterprises on Cyprus, for example, or in other countries, not only to create the obstacles, the conditions to avoid taxation, but also to ensure that the property will be not taken by the state or by the other oligarchs. So to protect the property by registration in other countries. Maybe it's the same case for Ukrainian oligarchs. And then, for example, in the case of Russia, some money which is laundering in Cyprus, for example, it came back to Russia investing in different spheres of economy. Maybe the same case is in Ukraine. And the last point, when we're speaking about the share of profit shifting and we in the comparison of the taxes paid on the territory of Ukraine, it will be useful to compare with the situation in other countries, with the so-called shadow economy in other countries or which are under transformation, the post-Soviet countries. For example, in Estonia, this share of shadow economy is rather small. But in my country, in Latvia, it's rather big in the comparison with, and also we can say that in these countries which are members of European Union, we can notice this profit shifting, but and we must compare in numbers, in proportions, with the Ukrainian situation. Maybe it is the Ukrainian situation is the same as in other post-Soviet, post-communist countries, both in the European Union or outside the European Union. Maybe it's not an exclusion, maybe it's a rule for many countries. I think it's all this moment.
More questions, or first round maybe you're answering and then we are continuing, yeah? So, please.
Yes, I would like, I was wanting actually to make some comments, and after the interventions, I think they could be worthwhile. And I'm going to leave afterwards for Alexander and for the researchers actually to reply to the more detailed questions. But I think a few issues that were raised before also were on whether the Ukrainian example is the only example on this, or is this actually, or is this more general than, and actually I think it should be mentioned that there have been previous studies, some with the same or similar methodology and others with other methodologies that have been conducted in the past in relation, for example, to the export of gold. I think it was from Zambia several years ago, and not from Ukraine but from other countries as well. And even with Norway, actually, several years ago, there was a research by Simon Pack which referred to the export of oil from Norway, which also showed some interesting results in terms of the illicit financial flows and the mispricing of oil also from Norway. So there's several cases around the world, and as was mentioned before, actually, one of the underlying problems is the international legislation in this respect, even when part of it, as was mentioned by the researchers, has been addressed in a way by the discussions in BEPS action plan and so on. Part of the problem is also that the legal system then internationally does not allow for some of these illicit financial flows to be actually addressed. In particular, actually, there's, and as it's mentioned in the study, the sixth method allows, which for transfer pricing of commodities, which is in the legislation of Ukraine, either has not been implemented or there's some difficulties probably with the connection with that sixth method with the rest of the transfer pricing legislation even. So that's one side. The other thing was in terms of the shadow economy, although I cannot comment particularly on the case of Ukraine, on the size of its shadow economy, I have to say that normally the measures of the shadow economy do not address this aspect of the mispricing of commodities or the mispricing of exports. In generally, that is not you cannot, with the current methodology that is used for the measure of the shadow economy, that's not seen directly. That is not part of the measurement. It's other problems, yes, of illicit financial flows that are represented by measures of shadow economy. But I wanted to highlight also another aspect that was addressed that I think is not, it is quite relevant, that was addressed that one of the problems is actually the available information on these exports in order to be able, the difficulties in finding public information in this respect, and I think that's actually one of the measures that can be or should be claimed in this respect. The availability of public information. There's also actually a discussion that was ongoing in the European Parliament on public country-by-country reporting, something that is blocked at the moment in the Council, and when there's no advance on that, and public country-by-country information, even when we would not particularly publish the information on the amount of exports from one country to the other one, it would actually be useful in order to have a broader image of what is happening to cases such as the Ukraine iron ore exports and to where the illicit financial flows are heading, I think, even when it can be completed by other studies. So I wanted to mention that, and the final comment also that was also mentioned is whether this is the percentage of this, or the size of this problem in terms of illicit financial flows is bigger or smaller than the problem dealing with corruption, for example, illicit financial flows coming out of corruption. Well, there's a study actually on this, an international study from 2005 from Vakulchyk, which actually does address this problem in a more international way, and says 65% of the problem of illicit financial flows come from the from tax evasion and tax avoidance by companies, yes, normally multinational companies that actually can arbitrate between different legislation in order to comply with all legislations and in a way and make use of all legislations to create these illicit financial flows. But the size of corruption, as measured by Vakulchyk and its time, it was quite smaller. However, still, probably the problem is in the legalization of part of these methodologies, in the way the current legislations allow for these illicit financial flows to occur. So just wanted to mention that here.
Can I reply to Mr. Gala and Mr. Mitrofanov? We're very happy you liked our study, you found it interesting, and also we value your support. You said that you want Ukraine to get over the old ways and move on to new ways. Just wanted to, and you seem to emphasize the importance of transparency. So we could probably discuss this further. You mentioned transparency of financing parties, so that's one idea, that internally and externally we could put pressure on authorities. But also I would add to this transparency of exports. To give you an example, the iron ore in particular is so-called part of the extractive industry. So in extractive industry there is EATI initiative. Yeah. Yes. And then now it's implemented in two directives on transparency and accounting since 2007. So according to this directive, if those Ukrainian companies were EU companies, they would have to report all fiscal payments deriving from this business in Ukraine. So be it in the country where they produce or somewhere else. So for instance, they're dealing with the Swiss branch, they would have to report on the taxes they pay in Switzerland. But that would be valuable information, because from this information we could derive at what price they were reselling via Switzerland. So, but because EU is already Ukraine already implemented a lot of EU legislation, we could put this pressure on Ukraine and say, look, implement the directives on accounting transparency. Show us on the iron ore where the profits, fiscal payments are. And also we could put pressure on fiscal service. You say transparency, but our study indicated probably fiscal service is not performing in the interest of the state or of the people, more in the interest of the companies. So, but this is a body governed by some Ukrainian legislation, and maybe there should be control or some pressure on how they operate. Maybe they make more public. Sometimes they publish, they say, last year we find exporting companies for $5 million because they manipulated the price. So maybe this information should be made more transparent, more public. Which companies and which manipulation, what prices you used. And final point to you is, also we hear that there's discussions on implementation of the association agreement with Ukraine, and maybe this sort of issues, topics, could be brought to the discussion, and we would be happy to contribute, to provide you with information and facts to support this. To Mr. Mitrofanov, the statements you made by the cheap labor and those are of course commonplace. Everyone agrees, big issues for our countries. In terms of tracking profits and where they end up, I'm not exactly sure what focus you wanted to put there, but we wouldn't jump up with joy if we know that from some of the money come back as investment. In fact, we already know this. Strangely, Switzerland and Cyprus, I think, the biggest investors in Ukrainian economy.
Yes.
But this still, the tax is lost, and the profits lost in Ukraine, which could be used for raising salaries and wages, and then through the profits retained in Ukraine, also personal income tax could be more payments. So for us, I think it's clearly better to retain these profits where they originated. And comparing to other countries, as I personally would agree with what Helmut said, that the systems are similar. So we all know, I don't know how much you know, that how this system was formed, 1990s, asset grabbing, and I think that created huge concentration of assets in a few hands, and also this ethos, shall I call it, almost gangster ethos from 1990s is still unfortunately present in the economy.
Further remarks, questions? Yeah?
I'm not an economist. I have no clue about trade. So to be very clear, and from the concrete details, I understand only half. So, but I'm working on foreign affairs and dealing with the implementation report, and therefore I would like to recognize some of the issues. This is a clear case of tax avoidance. It's a clear case of tax avoidance. And all of us, we know about this, and we know that it's not only a problem of Ukraine, but also a problem all over the world, including in the EU. So I know about conditionality, nevertheless I find it highly difficult to explain to voters, to taxpayers in my own country, why we cannot do anything about tax avoidance, and the figures are nearly the same, tax avoidance and macro-financial assistance. So I find it difficult to explain. I know that about conditionality, I know what it is, that here in Ukraine we do a lot, but nevertheless I simply would like in this honorary room, with the rapporteur having here to raise this question again. I'm very, very grateful to the implementation rapporteur that he raises the social issues in Ukraine. Please look at the draft report, or then look at the report adopted in the parliament. The social problem is raised in this report. And I can compare, because at the same time I'm dealing with Moldova and Georgia and all the all kind of reports, the parliament is aware of the social problem in Ukraine and the discrepancy between these rich people and the people on the ground. Nevertheless, having seen this mine and the trade unionists you spoke about and knowing that they get only 300 euro and have to pay 100 euro, I think that you have to do much more. And I would like to repeat here also that the administrative hurdles to organize a strike in Ukraine, and you spoke about 6 months or something like this, are so high.
It's not finished yet. It's been 6 months, but
Okay.
there's no decision.
So maybe we should do here something also and raise the issue again, because it's also difficult in other countries to organize a strike. A trade union it's all over the world difficult, but to have such hurdles I find really remarkable. I have the following questions. You rightly raised that it's surprising that Switzerland and Cyprus who are the main investors. Is there any research? Who are these people from Switzerland and Cyprus who invest in Ukraine? Because in my view, this is one of the crucial questions. So it seems to be a little bit of money laundering. Maybe these are Ukrainian oligarchs, but I was a little bit surprised even not to see the word Russia in this study. So I can't imagine that after so many decades of cooperation, integration, there's nothing. So maybe you can answer this question. We only speak here about the West, but in my view that's not right. There are so close links today between Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs, at least from what I read, that this should be also an issue. Thank you.
Yeah?
Just I think there is certainly very comparable behavior of those who try to avoid taxes and to enrich themselves and get it out of the country legally. Simply size-wise, the Russian oligarchs are the big ones in comparison and the Ukrainian ones the small ones. Although for themselves they would like to have to practice the same habits, I think what the smaller Ukrainian oligarchs, they do not want to even more strengthen the Russian stance in Ukraine. So I don't think that it would be Russians who would from Switzerland invest or from Cyprus invest in Ukraine. I think it is some, what is the English word for strawmänner? Is that what the English word for them? They are puppets. They are probably their own puppets somehow getting reinvested there. One thing that, as I said, Ukrainians don't want is to have even more Russian influence in their businesses there. In this regard, I think as Cyprus is an EU member, we have other ways and means to make issues known and ask the Commission and ask the or whomever or our own other institutions, Olaf, whether they are aware of certain practices emanating from Cyprus. I mean, I mean, their business model should not be allowed simply unhindered to continue. I mean, with regard to, I mean, if we look in detail, we have many member states who have specific legislation for specific enterprises. I mean, why is it that IKEA is a foundation under Dutch law? Normally wouldn't make sense that IKEA is such a, but because there is a loophole. Why is it that something happens in Luxembourg and other things, well, in Switzerland is outside the EU? But I think the political objective is to develop countries and to get and to also for the normal people to see light at the end of the tunnel. We have all interest to support first transparency, then pressure, and then see what the result is. As I said, in legislation, I see slow but steady progress in Ukraine, and that is why they are so vividly opposing it. How, if we see how for the High Anti-Corruption Court, they brought 2,000 amendments for this law. That is what we call spam legislation, simply to delay the entire process, because they know what will be happening. Once this NABU, the Anti-Corruption Office, plus the High Anti-Corruption Court will be efficient, it's an end to this practice. And that is what they want to delay. And so that is why we have to continue on these big issues and address others, like here in this study and so on, to end that. And insofar, I think we should have a broad, united approach here in the Parliament. Yes, it is our taxpayers' money that gives them grants, but it is for a good sake. And I would say, having been there in the East last week and looking how, also for the social projects, how much money is spent there for the water quality in Avdiivka, for to support traumatized children in the war zone, and to the GIZ is active with several hundred people getting these amalgamated communities and the communal reform running and delivering better. I think most of our money is well spent and reaches those levels where the people are profiting, and it's not that we are, so to say, compensating just what the oligarchs are exporting and not paying.
Let me add one idea. I agree that transparency, pressure, certain support maybe is important, but it must be also clear who we are supporting and why we are supporting. And we have in this legislative term reached a legislation in the international trade policies which is linked to the dumping of prices at the international market. So it means if there is, as you said, or as you have shown in your study, that there is by purpose, by system, certain dumping approach by not paying the prices according to the wages, etc., then the EU should act immediately because it is against the EU legislation in this field. And here we have, that's why I say, we have to take your fact findings for dealing with the reality, and we have to question to the Commission probably, and we have to question to the what is happening, what is going on. So if the ambassador is saying yes, the main obstacle is, then we have to say how to deal with it. So it is not enough to constitute a certain development, but we have to change the approaches. That I think is the main task. And here I would ask if you can explain a little bit. Do you really see a will from the European Union side to interfere, or only in stating, stressing what is happening? And that means we are not changing it. So here we have to probably to develop more closer exchange of information on views, etc., to interfere in the concrete acting of the responsible on both sides for dealing with the shaping the economic trade cooperation.
Okay, if I may, in the next round of questions, I can start. Start with a small comment to link Russian, Cyprus, and one of the mines. So you'll see in the study there is a company in the table which lists the company is called Sukha Balka. Now it says it belongs to Ukrainian oligarch who owns DCH Group registered in Cyprus. So this is the same company where the miners started the strike, which led to this study. It's Sukha Balka miners in the picture. and also the previous owner until 2017 was Roman Abramovich. So, so there is some linkage. But Karin, to answer your question, but also then I'll turn to Zahar to see if he agrees or not. Yeah, there are historically, of course, yeah, there are links in the economy. But my personal impression from the economic studies I've done, that actually the links are not that strong. I would say the Ukrainian economy is controlled by Ukrainian oligarchs. Russian kind of ownership is here and there, a little bit, some banks, you know, some mines, but it's not enough to, you know, set political agenda, for example, internally. Then on the Cyprus, it's interesting point that Mr. Gala raised. It's another idea that we're going to generate it today. That yeah, because it's an EU state, it has to follow also this transparency and accounting directives. So we could be putting transparency pressure on Cyprus because some of the companies are registered in Cyprus, that they make public the data that if trading is done via them or they own an iron ore mine in Ukraine, they have to show their financial flows and fiscal payments. On Dutch law is interesting because actually by far the biggest iron ore exporter is the company that belongs to the richest oligarch, Akhmetov, Metinvest. And Metinvest is headquartered, registered in Netherlands. So that's how they do their things. Also on Akhmetov, in terms of size, yeah, there are, I would say there are more oligarchs in Russia, but some Ukrainians are also pretty rich. Akhmetov in 2008, he bought the most expensive property in Europe. It was Guy Park 1 in London. So it was, he bought their flat for 30 million. So they're quite rich. Then, yeah, on 2,000 amendments, okay. On water in Avdiivka, I think you're probably referring to European Investment Bank's projects in Ukraine, rehabilitation in the, yeah. So, strictly speaking, okay, EIB loans are guaranteed by the EU budget, but it's not real kind of cash expenditure of the EU. So this, whereas in this macro-financial assistance is directly from EU budget. So we think that this money from EU budget could be better spent than just closing the holes in Ukrainian budget created by others. Also now to what Helmut said, it's also a good idea, another one, is on dumping prices. I'm not sure about dumping, how we can link it to dumping, but I think DigiComp, we could request DigiComp to look into this because it creates unfair competition for Ukrainian exporters. So you reduce your tax payments. So you export at a lower price, you pay less taxes, so you financially get a financial advantage compared to others. So maybe DigiCompetition could look into this. Again, taking into account that Ukraine now is quickly implementing EU legislation. Okay, so that's all I have to say.
Let me say a couple of words about the Cyprus investment. It is absolutely clear that net capital flow is negative, that only a very small fraction of the money withdrawn from Ukraine by this transfer pricing and actually some other mechanics, only very small part is going back to Ukraine. For example, 5 years ago, it was very popular was the royalty scheme when to have examples, the big metallurgical plants use the trademark which was owned by Cyprus enterprise, and each year it was hundreds of millions payments just for using this trademark, which is actually it's a trademark owned by Ukrainian oligarchs, Metinvest. And Of course, if it would be zero investment from Cyprus, it would be better for Ukrainian economy, because it's clearly that if this money remains in Ukraine, it would be much better, and they would work for Ukraine much better. Of course, Russia is still a significant investor in Ukraine. Actually, yes, the flow of investment from Russia dropped very significantly, but yeah, and some investments are withdrawn. Like one of the mines, it was a Yevras-Sukhabalka mine. It was sold for Ukrainian owner, but still Russia is active in banking sector, in many sectors, and still it's around 1/3 of foreign direct investment is from Russia, and a little bit more from Cyprus.
No, just, yeah. No, yes, as only also in a general more, in a general aspect or general view of the problem of the reinvestment through tax havens. It's a problem not only for Ukraine, but even for EU countries and for the whole world in itself. But it's probably difficult, though, not to actually know who's investing from Cyprus, because the difficulties in the exchange of information or the availability of information in this respect still obstruct a very thorough analysis of who's investing in it. Although there are some analyses from different countries, and even the EU the European Commission has actually some studies in this respect. So, but just I actually only wanted to add that recently the tax 3 committee went to Latvia, and one of the issues actually that was addressed in Latvia was the use of shell companies, and the Latvian, an interesting comment that relates to this study was that the Latvian authorities were actually saying, okay, so now we've modified the legislation, but we still have a problem in terms of EU countries, because we cannot discriminate from investors within the EU, even if they are coming from tax havens within the EU. So we can actually do not put a stop to them. So, so even when in the case of Ukraine is different, I guess in their relationship with the EU, they might have similar problems if they try to discriminate from one country or the other one. So probably I think the anti-dumping or what the things that are relevant, and going back to the study, one of the very relevant things from this study is actually that it analyzes very detailed cases and specific cases, which can actually be used in order to see, okay, what did happen with these cases in terms of this mispricing of goods and the compliance of anti-dumping regulations. So yeah, so that's what I wanted to add, and yeah, the rest has been said, I think, already. Yes, thank you very much.
But maybe one more question. But what is the reaction of general public in Ukraine or Ukraine when such researches are published? Is any interest, for example, from the newspapers or from TV? What is the reaction?
Very good question. Thank you. You should bring us to one of the points we wanted to make an announcement. So in fact, this is a double event. We're doing a presentation here in Brussels, and then in Kiev it will be on the 4th of October. So it'll be a press conference and a presentation. In terms of media interest, there's already media interest, because I don't know if you've heard, the Spiegel had an exclusive right to publish about this study last Saturday in paper version. But then Ukrainian media picked it up, and over the last few days, all the main online news websites quoted the Spiegel article. But now we're gonna make, from today, the actual study will be available on the GUE group website, and also translation to Ukrainian, press conference, and also arranging an interview with in one of the major journals in Ukraine, interview with authors. So the media, at least now, has a lot of interest to this. This topic of offshores, oligarchs in Ukraine is quite hot. Although some oligarchs sometimes in their statements they say they're against oligarchs, yes, it's a different matter, but public support.
That is definitely, such things are reported, as you rightly say. I mean, yes, many media outlets belong to oligarchs, but they are in some way in competition to each other. So at least the variety of opinions or the variety of viewpoints comes out, although one might, from our point of view, not always like the ownership. But as such, and that is definitely the difference to Russia, there is a variety in the public sphere where people take note. And also when it is about when they are asked what is their biggest concern, apart from their personal economic situation, which is dire for most of them, the second point is that this corruption, that is the issue that really concerns them, and then comes the war in the east. So, but I think there is, it is well received in the sense that people are interested, and then of course also to see, well, how is then the reaction? Is there something happening? And I think we are the ones, among others, who should push that change is made.
So yeah, please spread the word. In Kiev there will be a more detailed discussion because the study will become available, and there's already indication that there will be a lot of journalists and NGOs will come.
So thank you all for the study, for the work you have done. I'm very much agree that of course something has to, there must be conclusions, there must be steps afterwards to change the situation, because as I said in the beginning, the reality is for the citizens very precise and concrete. And if there is no change in their daily life, they will not trust into politics. So the disappointment about policies, the frustration is growing, and that is not stabilizing a society which has to overcome a lot of difficulties, as well as to go on in the 22-year struggle of transformation. And here I think also the responsibility of the European Union, and we of course will also try to be transparent and look for pressure on the European authorities who are dealing with the concrete shaping of the bilateral relations, and hopefully you in Ukraine and we here in the European Union can cooperate in this way to change the situation as it is described in the study. So good luck, and hopefully we keep contact on that. Thank you.